Hello and welcome to Voice of Russia debate. I am Nikolai Gorshkov and I will be discussing the outcome of the NATO summit in Wales. Its blueprint for tomorrow, as its outgoing Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said at the news conference. Well, it was originally expected to be a dull, mundane affair of discussing lessons learned from Afghanistan and some brainstorming maybe in the search for new raison d'etre after what looked like the end of an era of military incursions into Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. The almost moribund NATO, in the words of quite a few commentators, was facing yet another challenge of reinventing itself. Not anymore, though. One might suggest that if there was no Ukraine crisis, it should have been invented. Or was it? Some tough words were spoken at the summit and some tough action is pending. So where to now for NATO, Russia and Ukraine? To discuss this, I am joined in the Voice of Russia London studio by Sunny Hundal, journalist, political commentator, editor of the political blog Liberal Conspiracy, Dr. Ian Kearns, co-founder and director of the European Leadership Network, Chris Nineham, co-founder and vice chair of Stop the War Coalition, and on the line from Moscow, a political analyst with Voice of Russia, Dmitry Babich. Welcome to the debate, gentlemen. The NATO summit's agenda and its running order were changed several times over in reaction to events on the ground, mostly in Ukraine and Iraq. Is NATO trying to firefight here rather than painstakingly work to create an all-inclusive system of collective security from the Atlantic to the Pacific, as Russia has been suggesting for a long time? Chris Nineham.
Well, I think in a certain sense both. I think the crises that we're seeing in Iraq and in Ukraine are the product of decades of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. We've seen, I think, 12 new Eastern European countries accede to NATO since 1991. And I think that's the background to the situation in Ukraine. Clearly, the background to what's happened in Iraq is the occupation, primarily, fundamentally, the invasion and occupation of 2003 onwards. So the more aggressive foreign policies that have been pursued by NATO and its leading member countries particularly have created the crises. But now you very much have the feeling that the leadership doesn't know how to deal with them. It doesn't have any solutions apart from almost reluctantly more of the same. We're talking about growing pressure to escalate the bombing in Iraq and increased sanctions against Russia, but a kind of gradual drawing in of more forces into the theatre in Eastern Europe. So you kind of feel they don't really know how to respond to the mayhem that their policies over the last 2 or 3 decades have caused.
Well, we heard, of course, a lot during the summit and before it that, thank goodness, NATO has expanded before the current crisis, because at least now a lot of countries feel more safe than they otherwise would have been had NATO not expanded. But this is, especially in the face of Russia's perceived belligerence. Isn't this really a question of chicken and egg? Whether NATO expansion is a result of Russia's perceived belligerence, or is Russia's perceived belligerence a result of a relentless NATO expansion? Dr. Kearns.
Well, I think that's a good question, because there were many analysts in the West, including very influential ones like George Kennan, who opposed the enlargement of NATO into Eastern Europe. And that wing of the debate wasn't able to win the argument, and NATO enlarged. You're right that if you go to many capitals in Eastern Europe, that their strong perception there is that they wanted to be inside NATO because they feared Russia. They feared what kind of actor Russia would become when the Soviet Union broke up. And they now, many of them, view what's happened as a justification of their original fears and are very pleased that they're inside NATO because they think it provides them with some kind of protection. And I think although one can be very critical of many things that Western leaders have done, I personally was very critical of the intervention in Iraq. Although one can be very critical of that, it's a gross overstatement to say that what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Iraq are just a product of NATO policy. I mean, there are lots of other actors here which have to take a substantial portion of the responsibility. And right now, I think inside Ukraine, President Putin has to take a lot of responsibility for what's going on. I think many analysts in Russia and President Putin and his advisors themselves have made a mistake with Ukraine. They feared that Ukraine would become part of NATO. And I think the reason why this is a mistake is that there is just no consensus inside NATO to offer membership to Ukraine, or to Georgia for that matter. I've noted people already commenting today that Rasmussen's talked about some support for Georgia. The key decision that was taken by NATO in terms of enlargement this year was 2 months ago, And it basically made clear to the Georgians and to everybody else that nobody else was getting in from the Caucasus, Ukraine, or anybody else. And there's absolutely no chance of Ukraine being offered NATO membership, or Georgia being offered NATO membership for the next decade at least, and probably 2 decades.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, let's actually go to a Russian analyst here. Is not Russian reaction an overreaction, really?
Well, first I would like to disagree what Ian Kearns just said. With all due respect, I didn't conclude from the statements from Mr. Rasmussen that NATO membership is not in view for Ukraine for such a long period. He basically just recently visited Kiev, and he said that if Ukraine gives up the legislation which makes it a non-bloc country, according to a certain Ukrainian law, Ukraine cannot be a member of a military bloc. So if Ukraine lifts that legislation, it can join NATO. And now that Ukraine, I will be calling a spade, now that Ukraine is no longer a democracy, that there is just one group of parties and one ideology ruling the country, unopposed, unlike it was during the last 23 years, it will be very easy to lift this law, because now the south and the east of the country are not represented in the new parliament. They will not be represented starting from October, and right now the parliament is completely, under the influence of the prime minister, the president, and the group that holds power. So it will be very easy to join NATO under such circumstances. For Georgia, it's the same situation. Mr. Rasmussen at the NATO summit has just said that they are preparing a package of documents. Today I watched an interview on BBC with Georgi Margvelashvili, the Georgian president. He said that his country was going to join NATO. It was in the works. And I perceive what's going on very tragically. I think what we see now is the whole security system in Europe crumbling. Europe facing much graver danger of war than at any time since the end of the Second World War, probably since the early 50s. And I also would like to say that with Syria and Iraq, I tend to agree with Chris Nineham, because, but, this Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, just recently it was battling President Assad. And obviously it profited from lots of aid that was provided to the anti-Assad opposition by the United States, by the European Union, by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar. At the time, we heard that there were no terrorists fighting against Mr. Assad, that it was just the Syrian media that called these people terrorists. This is a very usual quote that you heard from the Western media, that it's just the Syrian media who calls these people terrorists.
This begs a question. What is the biggest threat to NATO countries' security right now? Some people would actually say that probably it's the homegrown jihadis who are returning or about to return, battle-hardened in Syria and Iraq, or about to return. I was about actually to ask Sunny Hundal.
But I can tell you very briefly, I think the greatest danger to NATO is NATO itself, its own aggressive and unpredictable actions. The crisis in NATO, the crisis in Ukraine was created by NATO and by the European Union when they put Ukraine before a choice it hated to make. Before a choice, it's either the European Union or Russia. Ukraine is a country with two heads. If you push towards the west too much, the east falls off. If you push towards the east too much, the west falls off. This is the reason why President Kuchma and then later President Yanukovych and even President Yushchenko, why they never said 100% yes or no to Russia or to the European Union, because the moment they say it, they would have been ruling just 50% of their country. So what happened was a direct consequence of NATO's actions. What happened in Iraq is a direct consequence of NATO's actions, because they supported the anti-Assad rebellion in Syria. And when this rebellion got out of control and started to create a Sunni caliphate, that was the consequence of the Western involvement in the Syrian civil war.
We'll return to this issue later, but Sunny Hundal, is it not true that probably the biggest threat might come from within, and it's not the external aggressor, whom NATO should be, preparing to deal with, but rather internal, internal incompetences?
Well, I doubt it. I mean, just to give you some figures, over 1,000 people have now been killed in the conflict, mostly Eastern Ukrainians in Europe over the last few months since Russian aggression into eastern Ukraine. And over 1 million people have been displaced from that area. Now, the point here is that it wasn't that the Ukrainian government was put into a sort of a bind by NATO. The problem is that Russia invaded Ukraine, and that was directly because of the fact that the Ukrainians themselves, if we remember, and everyone seems to have conveniently forgotten this, that the Ukrainians themselves rose up against the government last year, against their policies, and said they wanted to be closer to the EU. Now, I find it astonishing that people from, for example, Stop the War and others have completely ignored the fact that Russia invaded Crimea and annexed it, which was illegal under international law because it wasn't their territory. There's no getting away from that fact. So you cannot say NATO is responsible for imperialism and completely ignore the fact that Russia invaded another country, annexed their territory. I mean, and also the other point about Iraq is also ridiculous. The Syrian coalition and the opposition to Assad has changed over time. And obviously, the Islamic State has become much more of a threat and it's become a problem. But the Islamic State themselves attacked, defeated and killed a lot of the secular opposition, which initially what the US government was supporting. So those people have died. It's not the Islamic State that the USA was funding. On the other hand, the Russian government did fund and is still funding Assad, a guy who has now killed over 200,000 Muslims in that area. No one seems to have been condemning that fact. This guy has killed 200,000 people. So, if you're going to blame someone for aggression, then you have to blame Assad and you have to ask who's funding that. If you want to blame someone for aggression in Ukraine, you have to ask why are 1 million people displaced and why 1,000 people in that area have lost their lives. And those people have not lost their lives because of NATO. They have lost their lives because troops came in from Russia and because they have started sort of fighting with militias, people from eastern Ukraine. I mean, this bizarre redrawing of history is funny, but it's just not the truth.
Sunny, I'm afraid it's a little bit more complicated than that because
Can I say a few words in response?
Yeah. Just a second.
I think we all want to do
yes,
that.
I think the sequence of events, it's a long one, but it started with some violent clashes in Kiev. And Dmitry, like you said, Ukraine is not a homogeneous country, and people in the east of the country were really taken aback and afraid by what they saw happening in Kiev. They didn't want this to happen in
but they
their
didn't
parts
ask
of
for
the
Russia
world.
to invade.
Yeah,
Yes,
let me just
Kearns.
make a couple of points. I mean, first of all, let me unusually perhaps agree with some things that Dima Babic had to say. I agree with him about the gravity of the situation. I don't think this is a little local difficulty in Ukraine. I think we're on the verge of something potentially very serious indeed in terms of confrontation between Russia and the West, which could turn military, either intentionally or unintentionally. There are a number of moving parts here which could lead to unintentional escalation. I also agree, and I've said on Voice of Russia programs before, that the European Union, as opposed to NATO, made a fundamental mistake in some of its rhetoric with regard to Ukraine. Some Western leaders were talking about a civilizational choice for Ukraine, and I think it was a fundamental mistake, because Dima is right that Ukraine is a divided country, although it's not as divided as many in Russia like to portray, but it is a divided country, not only in terms of sentiment and politics and nationality, but also economically. It needs to face both ways. And if Ukraine is to have a future, a reasonable future with a reasonable economy, it has to do productive economic relations with Russia and with the West. And so some practical way of establishing that needs to be found. But again, not surprisingly, let me disagree with one other very important point that Dima made. I mean, and this is, I think, a mistake that Russian analysts and policymakers make time and time again. They mistake what is essentially a Western deceit, a deceit carried out with regard to its own publics, as some kind of geopolitical power play on the part of NATO. Let me explain what I mean. Western leaders like to sound tough. They want to talk about the fact that nobody is allowed to determine who becomes a member of NATO. And so all the stuff you're hearing from Rasmussen today, coming out of the summit, is all aimed at saying to the West's own publics, nobody gets to push us around. Russia doesn't, and it's aimed at the eastern members of NATO as well, basically saying Moscow doesn't have a veto on who's a member of our alliance. Okay, now, in Moscow, that's often portrayed as this enlargement is going to happen. But the reality is, and this is why I say it's a Western deceit, The reality is that Rasmussen can say what he likes. He can't deliver the 28 members of NATO behind a decision to enlarge to Georgia, and he can't deliver the members of NATO to enlarge to Ukraine. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a very good concrete reason. With regard to Georgia, for example, the real reason why Georgia